Picture a bison twice the size of the ones that roam Yellowstone today. Picture horns that stretch wider than a grown man is tall, tip to tip, curving out from a skull built like a battering ram. This was not a myth, and it was not a piece of folklore passed down by old ranchers. It was a real animal that walked across North America for roughly 200,000 years, long before a single human foot touched this continent. Its name was Bison latifrons, and most people in the United States have never heard of it, even though its bones have been pulled out of the ground in places as familiar as California, Texas, Florida, and the Great Plains. This is the story of the giant that vanished and the strange, tangled set of reasons why it disappeared. The animal was first identified back in 1825 by a naturalist named Richard Harlan, who examined a set of massive fossilized horns and skull fragments and realized he was looking at something that did not match any known living species. He gave it the name Bison latifrons, from Latin words meaning broad-fronted, a nod to the wide, thick skull that anchored those enormous horns. For a long time afterward, because only skulls and horn cores tended to survive well in the fossil record, scientists actually had a fairly limited picture of the rest of the animal's body. It took decades of additional digging and the recovery of leg bones and other post-cranial remains from sites scattered across the country before researchers could confidently estimate just how large this creature truly was. Some early reconstructions likely underestimated it. Others, based on isolated horn cores, may have overestimated it. It is only through comparing dozens of specimens found at multiple sites that today's scientists have arrived at a size range they feel reasonably confident in. Let's start with scale, because numbers alone barely do this animal justice. Bison latifrons stood somewhere around 8 feet tall at the shoulder. That is taller than a basketball hoop. Estimates for its body mass run as high as 4,000 pounds, which puts it 25 to 50% heavier than the modern American bison, the same species that still grazes in protected herds across the West today. Its horn span could reach over 7 feet from tip to tip. For comparison, the horns on a modern bison span barely 2 feet. If you stood one of these animals next to a modern buffalo, you would struggle to believe they were even related, but they were. Bison latifrons is the great-grandparent in an evolutionary sense of the shaggy animal you can still see in national parks. It's also worth pointing out just how close this animal comes to holding an outright global record. Depending on which measurements you compare, Bison latifrons rivals or even exceeds an African fossil bovid called Pelorivus, sometimes nicknamed the giant buffalo, for the title of the largest bovid that has ever lived on Earth. That means this North American giant was not simply the biggest bison or the biggest animal in its family on this continent. In terms of raw size, it was competing for the single largest spot among every cow, buffalo, and bison relative in the entire fossil record of the planet on any continent at any point in time. That is an astonishing fact that almost never makes it into casual conversation about American wildlife, even though the fossils sit in museum collections a short drive from major cities across the country. So where did this giant come from? The story does not start in North America at all. It starts in Asia, on the open steppe that once stretched from modern-day Siberia to the edge of what is now Alaska. During the depths of an ice age, sea levels dropped so low that a land bridge opened up between the two continents, a strip of exposed seafloor scientists now call Beringia. Herds of steppe bison, a species known as Bison priscus, wandered across that bridge sometime between about 200,000 and 130,000 years ago. They were not trying to conquer a new continent. They were simply following grass the way herbivores always do. But once those steppe bison arrived in the interior of North America, They encountered a landscape unlike anything in Siberia, with different plants, different predators, and different seasonal rhythms. Over tens of thousands of years, under those new pressures, isolated populations of steppe bison evolved into something new and something enormous. That something was bison latifrons. For roughly 200,000 years, this giant thrived. Fossils have turned up from southern Mexico all the way north into Canada, and from the Pacific coast of California clear across to Florida in the American Midwest. That is an almost unbelievable range for a single species, and it tells us this was not a fragile, narrowly adapted animal clinging to one type of habitat. It was a generalist capable of surviving in open grassland, mixed woodland, and everything in between. Isotope analysis, essentially a chemical fingerprint left behind in fossilized teeth and bones, shows that populations in different regions ate differently. Bison from Florida appear to have been almost pure grazers, cropping grass the way a modern bison does, but populations found at a site called Clark Quarry in Georgia show a mixed diet, switching between grazing on grass and browsing on shrubs and leaves depending on the season. In other words, this animal was flexible. It adjusted its menu to whatever the local environment offered, which is usually a sign of a species built to last. And for a long time, it did last. Imagine the world this animal lived in. This was Ice Age North America, a landscape crowded with creatures that sound almost fictional today. Mammoths and mastodons moved across the plains in family groups. Giant ground sloths, some standing taller than a grizzly bear, pulled down branches to feed. Camels, yes, actual camels, roamed what is now Texas and California, along with native horses that would later go extinct on this continent before European breeds were reintroduced centuries afterward. And stalking through all of it were predators built for a world of giants. Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, weighed up to 600 pounds and carried canine teeth nearly 7 inches long. The American lion, Panthera atrox, was larger than any lion alive today. Dire wolves hunted in packs across the open country. This was the ecosystem that bison latifrons had to survive in. Not a peaceful meadow, but a landscape where nearly every predator was built to bring down something big. Some of the clearest evidence for how these animals lived and died comes from an unlikely source, a set of sticky black pools in the middle of what is now Los Angeles. The La Brea tar pits formed as crude oil seeped up through cracks in the earth, and over tens of thousands of years, the heavier asphalt left behind on the surface trapped animals that wandered too close. Herbivores got stuck first, and then predators moved in to scavenge an easy meal, only to become trapped themselves. Scientists call this a predator trap, and it is part of why La Brea has produced one of the richest fossil records on the planet, more than 3.5 million specimens and counting. Among those specimens, researchers have identified at least 48 individuals of Bison latifrons, alongside hundreds of the somewhat smaller Bison antiquus, its evolutionary descendant. Recent isotope studies on the teeth of Smilodon recovered from these pits reveal something surprising. Rather than chasing bison across wide open plains the way old textbook illustrations always suggested, these saber-toothed cats appear to have preferred hunting in denser forested pockets, ambushing tapirs and deer at close range. It was dire wolves, running in packs across open grassland, that seem to have specialized in taking down bison and horses instead. It's a small detail, but it reshapes the whole picture of predator and prey in Ice Age California. And it shows just how much modern science is still rewriting what we thought we understood about this era. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because Bison latifrons disappears from the fossil record well before most of the famous Ice Age giants, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American lions, all of these held on until roughly 11 to 12,000 years ago, a period scientists call the Quaternary extinction event. Bison latifrons, by contrast, seems to have vanished somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 years ago, at the start of what is known as the last glacial maximum, the coldest and driest stretch of the most recent ice age. Some more recent finds, including remains recovered from South Texas, have pushed that window a bit later, closer to 13,000 years ago, suggesting the true picture is messier and more regionally variable than a single clean extinction date would imply. Either way, this giant bison was largely gone, or at least fundamentally transformed, well before the first confirmed humans set foot on this continent. It's worth sitting with that fact for a moment, because it runs against almost every popular narrative about Ice Age extinctions in North America. The story most people know goes something like this. Humans crossed into the Americas, discovered a continent full of animals that had never seen a human being before and had no instinctive fear of them, and hunted the biggest, slowest, most vulnerable species into oblivion within a few thousand years. That narrative, often called the overkill hypothesis, does explain a fair amount of what happened to mammoths, mastodons, and other giants around 11,000 years ago. But it cannot explain what happened to bison latifrons, because the giant bison was already disappearing from the fossil record roughly 10 to 20,000 years before any confirmed human presence on the continent. Whatever was happening to this animal, it was happening in a world without spear points, without fire drives, and without any human hunter anywhere nearby. That timing matters enormously because it removes the single easiest explanation. When most Ice Age megafauna died out, around 11,000 years ago, scientists have long debated how much blame belongs to human hunters, newly arrived and armed with sophisticated stone tools, versus how much belongs to a rapidly warming, rapidly changing climate. For bison latifrons, human hunting simply does not fit as a primary cause, at least not for the initial decline. The giant bison was already fading, and in a very real sense, already becoming something else, before the first Clovis hunters ever threw a spear at a bison on this continent. So, if it wasn't people, what was it? The leading explanation researchers point to is not a single dramatic event, but a long, grinding process of climate change. For nearly 2 million years, Earth's climate has swung back and forth between glacial periods, when ice sheets expand and the planet turns cold and dry, and interglacial periods, when things warm and the ice retreats. Each swing reshuffled the plant life across North America, and every reshuffle of plant life reshuffles which animals can survive where. Bison latifrons appears to have favored somewhat wooded mixed habitat, at least in some regions, rather than pure open grassland. As the climate ground toward the last glacial maximum, grasslands expanded and many forested and mixed habitats contracted or shifted. An enormous animal built for a particular kind of landscape and requiring an enormous amount of daily forage just to sustain that body mass is especially vulnerable when its preferred terrain starts shrinking or moving. Bigger animals need more food, more water, and more stable conditions, and they cannot hide or relocate as easily as smaller, more adaptable species can. And this is the part of the story that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Bison latifrons likely did not simply vanish. In a real sense, it shrank. As the climate deteriorated and resources became scarcer, natural selection appears to have favored smaller body size within these bison populations, a common evolutionary response when food becomes less predictable and less abundant. Over thousands of years, this pressure gave rise to a new form, Bison antiquus, sometimes called the ancient bison, an animal still larger than today's bison, but noticeably smaller than its giant ancestor. Bison antiquus is, in fact, the species most closely tied to the very first human hunters to arrive in North America, the Clovis people, roughly 13,000 years ago. Kill sites scattered across the Great Plains, some containing the remains of dozens or even hundreds of animals processed by early hunters, belong to this smaller, later species, not to the true giant that came before it, and the story continues from there. Bison antiquus itself eventually gave rise to the modern American bison, bison, the animal you can still see grazing today, smaller again than its ancient predecessor. Genetic evidence recovered from Bison antiquus shows a close relationship to living bison, reinforcing this picture of one continuous shrinking lineage rather than a series of unrelated species replacing one another. No ancient DNA has yet been successfully extracted from true bison Latifrons fossils, since they are simply too old and too degraded. But the physical, size-based trend across the fossil record from giant to ancient to modern tells a remarkably consistent evolutionary story on its own. So the honest answer to the question of what killed the largest bison in history is more nuanced than a single villain. It was not a spectacular meteor impact. It was not primarily human hunters, at least not in the earliest phase, since the timing simply does not line up. And it was likely not any single predator, since this animal had already been dealing with saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and American lions for tens of thousands of years without going extinct. Instead, the giant bison was worn down gradually by a shifting climate that steadily changed the landscape it depended on, favoring smaller, more adaptable bodies generation after generation, until the 8-foot-tall giant with the 7-foot horn span had effectively transformed itself out of existence, leaving behind a smaller, leaner descendant better suited to a colder, harsher, more open world. Later on, when humans did arrive on the continent, they encountered not the original giant, but this smaller descendant, and their hunting pressure, combined with continuing climate shifts, likely played a role in the further extinctions that reshaped the Ice Age landscape over the following few thousand years. In that sense, humans were part of the final chapters of the story, but not the opening one. There's another wrinkle worth mentioning, because good science rarely settles into a perfectly tidy timeline. A study published in more recent years examining bison remains recovered from South Texas produced radiocarbon dates suggesting some populations resembling bison latifrons may have persisted later than researchers once assumed, potentially overlapping with the very earliest window of human arrival in the Americas. If that dating holds up under further scrutiny, it would mean the transition from giant bison to ancient bison to modern bison was not a single clean, continent-wide event, but a patchwork process that played out at different speeds in different regions, with some populations shrinking and vanishing earlier in one part of the country while holding on a little longer somewhere else. That kind of regional variation is actually common in extinction events once scientists dig deeply enough into the data, and it's a good reminder that the fossil record rarely hands us a single dramatic date circled on a calendar. It hands us a messy, overlapping range, and the true story lives somewhere inside that range. There's something almost poetic in that. The largest bison to ever walk this continent was not erased by a single catastrophe. It endured ice ages, endured saber-toothed predators built to bring down giants, endured across 200,000 years and half a continent. What it could not endure in the end was its own success at being enormous. Once the climate stopped cooperating with an animal that size, it didn't lose a war. It adapted its way into a smaller, quieter version of itself. And that smaller version is still out there today, grazing on the same plains its ancestors once walked as giants. Every time you look at a modern bison, you are looking at the final, shrunken chapter of a lineage that once produced the largest bovid ever to live in North America. The horns are smaller now. The shoulders sit lower. But somewhere in that animal's bones is the echo of a creature that stood 8 feet tall and carried horns wider than a doorway, a giant that outlasted almost everything else in its world, right up until the climate itself decided the age of giants was over. That is the real story behind the title. Not a single killer, not one dramatic extinction event, but a slow, patient rewriting of an entire species by ice, grass, and time. And in a strange way, it never really ended. It just kept walking, smaller and smaller, all the way into the present day.